Everyone in that cathedral was waiting for me to scream, to collapse, to beg. That's what they expected from a woman who just watched her king take her sister's hand at the altar she was supposed to stand on. But I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe wrong. I just counted. 1. The sound of Mina's laugh, sharp and bright like a blade dressed in silk. 2. The exact weight of the secret I was carrying, his secret, pressed low against my ribs. 3. The number of exit routes I had already memorized from this very room. By the time Brahm's eyes found mine across that hall, searching for guilt, for tears, for something to hold over me, I was already gone. Not my body. My body stood perfectly still. But me? I had already left him. Here is what King Bram of Ravenwood never understood about me. He saw a loyal woman and called it weakness. He saw patience and called it obedience. He looked at every map I drew, every border I secured, every alliance I quietly negotiated from behind his throne, and he thought, she will never leave. She has nowhere to go. He forgot one thing. I drew the maps. Every hidden road, every forgotten pass through the frost peaks, every secret artery that kept his kingdom breathing, I put them there. I knew them by heart. And while he stood at that altar choosing a political alliance wrapped in my sister's smile, I was already mentally packing. Not jewelry, not gowns, maps, gold, and enough rage to fuel a kingdom. He didn't betray a bride that day. He armed one. I want to tell you something I've never admitted out loud. In the moment before I walked out of those cathedral doors, before I became the woman who outran a king, who dismantled bridges, who built something new from the ruins of everything he broke, I had one weak second. Just one. My hand went to my stomach. Instinct, reflex, love. And I thought, they will never know their father as anything but a mistake. I survived. That thought should have destroyed me. Instead, it steadied me because I realized I wasn't just leaving for me anymore. I was leaving for them. 2 lives, already fierce and secret, already mine. And in that hollow, echoing cathedral, while my sister laughed and a king made the worst miscalculation of his reign, I smoothed my red skirts, I lifted my chin, and I walked out carrying the only part of Brahm worth saving, his heirs, my future, my throne. Chapter 1. The First Pivot. The cathedral doors hadn't even closed behind me before my mind was already 3 steps ahead of my heart. That's the thing no one tells you about betrayal, the really clean kind, the kind that's been planned, rehearsed, executed with political precision. It doesn't hit you like a wave. It hits you like a door closing, quiet, final, and suddenly the room you've lived in your whole life has no handle on the inside. I walked back to my chambers the long way, not because I was lost, because I needed 60 seconds alone in the east corridor where no torches burned and no servants lingered. 60 seconds where I could press my back against cold stone and allow myself exactly one honest moment before I became the woman I needed to be. I pressed my palm flat against my stomach. Breathe, I told myself. They need you to breathe. One long inhale. The stone smelled like damp wool and candle smoke. I memorized that smell because I knew, the way you know things in your bones before your mind catches up, that I would never stand in this corridor again. Then I straightened and I walked. My chambers looked exactly as I had left them 3 hours ago when I was still a woman getting dressed for her own binding ceremony. My good silk brush sat on the vanity, a half-finished cup of chamomile tea, cold now, perched on the window ledge. Anwen had laid out my celebration gown, silver and cream, meant for the feast, across the foot of the bed like a ghost of the evening I was supposed to have. I didn't look at it. I went straight to the desk, bottom drawer, left side, beneath the false panel I had installed myself 2 years ago when I first understood that powerful men eventually betray everyone they stop fearing. My hands didn't shake. I remember being almost surprised by that, the steadiness of my own fingers as I lifted the panel and pulled out the oilskin roll. My maps. Every road I had ever surveyed, every pass, every hidden tributary, every crumbling servant's route that predated Brahm's grandfather's reign. I had drawn these myself, rode out in plain clothes, sometimes alone, cataloging the kingdom's skeleton while Brahm held court and accepted flattery and believed that power meant never needing to know the ground beneath your own feet. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. I rolled 3 of them tight and slipped them into the travel satchel I kept packed, always packed, another habit Brahm had once called paranoid and I had called practical. Inside, riding clothes, 2 changes, a knife, small enough to hide, sharp enough to matter, a leather pouch of gold coin, not a fortune, but enough to buy silence and speed in the right sequence. I did not pack the sapphire earrings he gave me on our first anniversary of courtship. I did not pack the letter he wrote me the winter I had fever, the one I had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. I left both of them on the vanity, side by side, like evidence. Let him find them. Let him understand exactly what I considered worth saving and what I did not. Gareth was at his post at the end of the private corridor, the one that led to the servants' gate and the stable yard beyond. Of course he was. Gareth was always exactly where he was supposed to be. It was his finest quality, and tonight my greatest inconvenience. He was a big man, Gareth, 40 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been rearranged by at least 2 serious fights and hadn't complained about it. He had served my father before he served Bram's household, which was the only reason I stopped walking when I saw him instead of finding another route. He looked at my satchel, he looked at my face. Something moved behind his eyes, recognition maybe, or the particular alertness of a man who has spent decades learning to read a room before a room decides to read him. "My lady," his voice was careful, "the feast is being prepared in the great hall." "I know where the feast is, Gareth." A beat of silence. "You'll want to step aside," I said. Not a request, not quite an order, something in between, the tone my mother had taught me, the one that assumed compliance without demanding it. "And you'll want to give me 1 hour before you report my absence to anyone." His jaw tightened. "My duty is to the king." "Your life," I said quietly, "was saved by my father at the Battle of Crestfall. You told me back yourself. You said you owed him a debt you could never repay because he was already dead." I held his gaze. "He had a daughter. She is standing in front of you right now asking for 1 hour." The corridor was very still. Somewhere far below us, I could hear the faint swell of celebration music beginning. Bram and Mina, beginning their feast, beginning their life, the kingdom swallowing the story whole. Gareth's eyes dropped to my satchel one more time. Then, slowly, he stepped to the side. 1 hour. I see nothing for 1 hour. I nodded once and walked past him toward the servants' gate, toward the stable yard, toward the cold dark beyond the castle walls. I was almost through the gate when his voice came low behind me. "My lady." I stopped, didn't turn. He doesn't deserve what he's losing. My throat closed around something sharp and sudden. I swallowed it, and I walked into the dark.
Chapter 2. The Mapmaker's Revenge. They came at dawn. I heard them before I saw them, the thunder of hooves carrying across the frost plains with that particular urgency that only belongs to men who believe they are hunting something that doesn't know it's being hunted. 6 riders. I counted the rhythm of the hoofbeats from my position on the ridge above the canyon mouth, crouched low behind a shelf of gray rock with my mare tethered 50 paces back in the tree line, quiet and still, because I had fed her well and she trusted me. That was the difference between Bram's riders and me. They were fast. I was prepared. I had made camp 4 hours into the frost plains, not because I was tired, but because I needed to think clearly, and I have never been able to think clearly while moving. I had unrolled the canyon map across a flat stone, traced the route with one finger in the weak moonlight, and planned the next 12 hours the way I used to plan supply routes for Bram's winter campaigns, methodically, without sentiment, accounting for every variable I could control and making peace with the ones I couldn't. By the time I broke camp and rode on, I had already decided exactly where I would let them find my trail. The Whispering Canyons earned their name from the wind. On still days, the narrow passages between the rock walls caught the air in a particular way and produced a low, continuous sound, not quite a moan, not quite a voice, but something uncomfortably close to both. The first time I had ridden through them, I was 17 and mapping the kingdom's eastern borders for my father's survey commission. I had been frightened then, genuinely unsettled by that sound, and I had sat with my discomfort and kept riding and mapped every inch of those passages until they were no longer a mystery to me. That was the only way I had ever known how to handle fear. Learn it completely, remove its power by removing its secrets. Bram's riders had no such map. More importantly, they didn't know they didn't have one. Men like that rarely know what they're missing until the ground gives way beneath them. I led them in at the northern mouth, deliberately, leaving clear tracks where the soil was soft near the creek bed, a trail obvious enough to read at speed, which told me everything I needed to know about what Bram had instructed them. Find her fast. He wanted this quiet. He wanted me retrieved before anyone in the kingdom had time to ask why the woman who was supposed to be celebrating her binding feast had disappeared before the first course was served. He wanted to manage the story. He always wanted to manage the story.
Inside the canyon, the wind began. That low, hollow sound pressing against the rock walls on all sides. And I felt something strange happen in my chest. Not fear, not this time. Something closer to recognition. Like the canyon was a version of me, carved by pressure, full of unexpected passages, mistaken by those who didn't know better for something to be crossed quickly rather than understood. I rode hard to the central fork. Left passage, it wound northeast for 3 miles before opening onto the plains, the route anyone looking at a basic survey map would identify as the logical exit. Bram's cartographers had produced exactly one survey of this region 4 years ago, and I had reviewed it personally. It showed the left passage as clear. What it didn't show, because the survey team had turned back when the wind unsettled their horses, and they were, ultimately, men who let their horses make decisions, was that the left passage narrowed to an impassable slot canyon approximately 2 miles in, where a seasonal rockfall had compressed the walls to less than 3 feet across, wide enough for a person on foot, completely impassable for horses or carriages. I had noted it on my own map. I had not shared that note with anyone. Right passage, that was mine. It curved south and west through a series of wider chambers before dropping down toward the river crossing and the road to the frost peaks beyond. Longer, less obvious, and at its entrance, if you knew where to look, if you had spent 3 days in this canyon at 17, tapping rock faces and testing fissures with the focused obsession of a girl who had decided that knowing things was the only power she could claim with complete certainty, there was a fracture line in the upper canyon wall. Not a crack, not yet. A potential. A rockfall waiting for one sharp impact at the right point. I had been carrying the iron stake and the short-handled hammer in the bottom of my satchel for exactly this moment, though I hadn't let myself examine that too closely. There is a version of planning that looks from the outside like cold-bloodedness. I preferred to think of it as the difference between a woman who survives and a woman who doesn't. I dismounted at the fracture point. My hands were steady. The sound of hooves in the canyon entrance echoed against the walls, closer now, the riders pushing hard, confident, men who had not yet discovered they were inside someone else's design. I set the stake against the fracture. I raised the hammer. And in the half-second before I brought it down, in that impossible sliver of silence between decision and consequence, I thought of Bram's face at the altar. Not the betrayal on it. Something worse. The absence of it. The clean, transactional calm of a man who had already moved on before the moment had even ended. The hammer fell. The mountain answered. And behind me, as I rode hard into the right passage, the canyon sealed itself like a wound closing, and somewhere in the roar of falling rock and the cries of startled horses, I heard the precise sound of a king's reach ending. It sounded like silence. It sounded like the first day of the rest of my life. Chapter 3. The Scent of Iron. The body doesn't care about your plans. That's the thing I keep coming back to even now. You can be the most prepared woman in 3 kingdoms. You can have your maps rolled tight and your gold counted and your escape route sealed behind you with the finality of falling rock. You can ride through the night with your jaw set and your mind running clean tactical calculations like a machine built for exactly this purpose. And then dawn comes up gray and cold over the Frost Peak foothills, and your stomach turns itself inside out, and you slide off your horse and onto your knees in the frost-stiff grass, and you are suddenly, humiliatingly, just a woman. Just a body, just a person who is more frightened than she has allowed herself to admit. I was sick for a long time that morning, longer than the previous mornings, which had been manageable, a wave of nausea, a few careful minutes, then steadiness returning. This was different. This was my body staging a protest against everything I had asked it to absorb in the last 18 hours, the grief and the cold and the hard riding and the fear I had been compressing into a very small, very dense ball somewhere behind my sternum and refusing to examine. When it was over, I sat back on my heels in the frost and pressed both hands against my stomach and just breathed. I know, I said out loud, to them,
to the two small lives that were at that point still more idea than reality, still something I had only confirmed with the kingdom's most discreet healer 6 weeks prior under the pretense of a persistent fatigue. I know. I'm sorry. I'm going to get us somewhere safe. The wind moved through the low scrub around me. My mare snorted quietly and nosed at the frozen ground. No other sound, no hoofbeats, no pursuit, not yet, not through that pass, not for a good while. I had bought us time. Now I needed to think about what came after time. The rowan trees grew in clusters along the creek beds in this part of the foothills, low, twisted things, with bark the color of old iron and roots that pushed up through the soil in knuckled ridges. Most people rode past them without a second look. They were not beautiful trees. They produced no useful timber, no edible fruit, nothing that registered as valuable to someone who measured value in obvious ways. My mother taught me about rowing roots when I was 9 years old. She was not a woman who believed that her daughter would always have servants, or a physician within easy reach, or a safe, warm room to be ill in. She was a practical woman, with a practical love, the kind of love that teaches instead of just protecting, that hands you knowledge like a blade and says, "Keep this, you will need it." I had thought of her teaching as theoretical for most of my adult life. I had lived in Ravenwood's Keep for 6 years, surrounded by every comfort, and the practical wilderness knowledge sat in the back of my mind like a folded map I never needed to unfold. I unfolded it now. The roots needed to be scraped, not cut, a shallow scraping of the outer layer to reach the pale inner flesh beneath, which was dense and intensely bitter in a way that hit the back of the throat like a fist. You chewed slowly. You did not swallow the pulp, only the juice. 3 minutes of this and the nausea retreated to a manageable distance, pushed back by whatever compound lived in that bitterness, and the stomach steadied. The second property was the one that mattered more, out here. Rowan root, when chewed and then applied to the pulse points, wrists, throat, behind the knees, released a compound that neutralized scent. Not completely, nothing natural was complete, but enough. Enough to blur the edges of what a tracking wolf would find, to turn a clear signal into something uncertain, something that might be a woman or might be a deer or might be nothing at all, just the mineral breath of the creek in the cold morning air. Bram had trackers who could follow a scent across 3 days of rain. He did not have trackers who could follow a ghost. I scraped the roots with my small knife, and I worked methodically, and I did not think about the fact that I was learning, only now after 6 years at Bram's side, how many of the things I had quietly managed for him had required me to diminish myself in the managing, how I had smoothed problems away before he saw them, how I had made his kingdom run like a clean machine while he received the credit for the silence. I thought about it a little. I allowed myself that much. There was a moment while I was pressing the root pulp against the inside of my wrists when the smell of it hit me, that sharp iron and earth smell, and something cracked open in my chest without warning. Not grief, older than grief, something that lived underneath grief. Loneliness. The specific loneliness of a woman who has been surrounded by people for years and has still been, in every way that mattered, completely alone. No one who knew all of her, no one she could afford to be uncertain in front of, no one who would have sat with her in the frost that morning and said, "I see how tired you are. I see how long you have been holding this." Bram had never seen it. He had looked at my competence and seen a resource. He had looked at my loyalty and seen a given. He had never once looked at me and seen the cost. I pressed my wrists together. The iron smell rose around me, clean and sharp.
Somewhere behind me, far back through the sealed canyon pass, I knew his best tracker had just crouched over the last clear print my mare had left in soft soil and was lifting his head, nostrils flaring, reaching for a scent that had, between one breath and the next, simply ceased to exist. I almost smiled. Then I heard it. Low, distant, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent 6 years sleeping beside a wolf king. A howl. Not his trackers. Him. Bram had come himself.
Chapter 4. The Broken Bridge.
I had 3 hours on him. Maybe 4. That's what I told myself as I pushed my mare harder through the foothills, the howl still echoing somewhere in the architecture of my chest where I was trying very hard not to feel anything. 3 hours was enough. 3 hours was a margin I could work with. 3 hours meant the Blackwater Bridge was still possible if I didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't allow myself the dangerous luxury of thinking too hard about what it meant that he had come himself. Because that was the part I couldn't afford to examine yet. Bram, not his riders, not his trackers. Him, shifted and running, which meant he had abandoned the feast, abandoned Mina, abandoned the careful political performance of his own wedding night to chase a woman he had publicly discarded approximately 14 hours ago. There was a version of me, the version that had loved him for 6 years, that had learned the specific weight of his silence and the exact temperature of his rare warmth, that wanted to assign meaning to that wanted to say, he realized, he understood what he threw away, he's coming because he finally sees it. I knew better. Bram came because I had taken something that belonged to him. Not me. I had never belonged to him, not really, not in the way that mattered. He was coming because somewhere in his calculating mind, the numbers had shifted. The woman who knew every secret road in his kingdom was gone. The woman who carried his heirs was gone. The variable he had marked as stable and contained had turned volatile overnight, and Bram could not tolerate an uncontrolled variable. He wasn't coming for love. He was coming for management. Knowing that made it easier to ride. The Blackwater Bridge came into view at mid-morning through a break in the tree line, a long, narrow crossing of timber and iron cables strung across the gorge where the Blackwater River had spent 10,000 years cutting itself a path through solid rock. The drop below was 60 feet to white water and jagged stone. The bridge itself was old but sound, maintained by the border toll keeper who lived in a stone hut on the Ravenwood side and collected passage fees from merchants and travelers moving between kingdoms. The toll keeper was not at his post. I didn't question it. I had learned early in my years of managing Bram's kingdom that small mercies were not to be interrogated. You accepted them, you moved, you thanked whatever force had arranged them later when you had time. I crossed at a trot, my mare's hooves loud on the timber planks, the bridge swaying in the gorge wind, the black water roaring 60 feet below with complete indifference to my circumstances. I kept my eyes forward. I had never loved heights. I had simply learned to move through them without stopping. On the Iron Duchy side, I dismounted, and I stood for a moment looking back at Ravenwood. The foothills I had ridden through, the gray sky sitting heavy over the frost peaks beyond, 6 years of my life on the other side of this gorge, my rooms, my desk, my half-drunk cup of chamomile tea that someone would have cleared away by now without knowing it was the last ordinary thing I had ever left in that keep. All of it over there. All of it already becoming something that happened to a previous version of me. I pressed my hand to my stomach. Brief, just a second. We made it this far, I told them. We're going to make it the rest of the way. Then I opened my satchel and took out the tools. The tension cables were the bridge's spine, 4 of them, 2 on each side, iron core rope as thick as my forearm, running the full length of the crossing and anchored into stone housings on both banks.
Without them, the timber deck would have no lateral stability. It would hold a cautious person moving slowly, but it would not hold the impact weight of a large wolf landing at speed, which is exactly the calculation I was making as I worked. I didn't need to sever the cables completely. That would take time and tools I didn't have. What I needed was to compromise the anchor housings on the Ravenwood side, specifically the iron bolts that fixed the cable ends into the stone. They were old bolts, older than the current bridge I suspected, retained through several rebuildings because the stone housings were solid and no one saw the need to replace what wasn't visibly failing. I had noted this 3 years ago when I surveyed the border crossing and written in my private record, "Anchor hardware aging, recommend replacement within 5 years, potential structural liability." No one had replaced them.
I worked quickly. My hands knew what they were doing even when my mind kept drifting to the sound of that howl, trying to calculate his speed, trying to gauge the margin between my work being finished and his arrival at the far bank. The bolts were corroded but not immovable. I used the iron stake from my satchel as a lever against the housing, and I applied the steady, patient pressure my father had taught me. Not brute force, never brute force, but consistent directional pressure at the exact point of greatest mechanical disadvantage. The first bolt gave with a sound like a bad tooth being pulled. The second followed 20 minutes later. I left the cables in place, still threaded through the housing, still appearing intact from a distance. They would hold a walking man. They would hold a cautious horse. They would not hold an alpha in full shift, hitting the bridge at running speed with the desperate momentum of a king who had never once in his life encountered an obstacle he couldn't simply overpower. I remounted. I rode 50 yards up the Iron Duchy bank to where the road curved around a granite outcrop, and I stopped there, and I waited. I don't know why I waited. I should have kept riding. Every rational part of me knew I should have kept riding. But I needed to see it. I needed to see his face when he understood. He came out of the tree line on the Ravenwood bank 40 minutes later, not in wolf form now, shifted back, standing at the bridge entrance in riding clothes that looked like he had thrown them on in the dark. His black hair was wild. There was a cut along his jaw I didn't recognize, from the shift or the riding or something else entirely. He looked, for the first time in 6 years, like he didn't know what to do next. His eyes found me across the gorge immediately. Of course they did. They always had. We looked at each other across 60 feet of air and 6 years of everything that was and everything that would never be now. And the wind moved through the gorge between us, and the black water roared below with its relentless, indifferent violence. He stepped onto the bridge. I watched the cables shudder. I watched him feel it, that subtle wrongness underfoot, the way the deck responded to his weight with a give that shouldn't have been there, the instinct of a predator recognizing a trap in the half-second before it closes. He stopped. He looked down, then back up at me, and I saw it cross his face. Not anger, not yet. Something rawer than anger. Something I had never seen on Bram's face in 6 years of watching him closely enough to draw a map of every expression he owned. He looked for just a moment like a man who had made an irreversible mistake and had only just now felt the full weight of it settle onto his chest. Lyra. My name across all that distance. Low, rough, like it had been dragged up from somewhere he didn't usually let people see. I gathered my reins. "You chose wrong, Bram," I said, clearly, calmly, the way I had said everything to him always, measured and controlled, giving nothing away that I hadn't already decided to give. I turned my mare toward the Iron Duchy road. Behind me, I heard the exact moment he tested the bridge again and felt the cables shift in their compromised housing, felt the chasm assert itself as something uncrossable, felt the king of Ravenwood encounter for the first time in his reign a border that his title could not simply dissolve. I didn't look back, but I heard him. One sound,
rough and broken and nothing like the controlled, calculated man I had spent 6 years beside. He said my name again, not commanding this time, not managing, just lost. Just a man standing at the edge of a self-made ruin, saying the thing he had thrown away as if saying it enough times might somehow call it back. It was the most honest I had ever heard him. It was also 4 months too late. I rode into the Iron Duchy, and I did not let myself cry until the granite outcrop was between us and I was completely, finally, alone. Then I cried for a long time. Not for him, for the woman who loved him so thoroughly, so patiently, so completely, and had never once been loved back with the same fierce, wholehearted certainty. She deserved better. I was going to make sure she got it. Chapter 5. The Rival's Gate. I had rehearsed this moment for 2 days of hard writing, not the words exactly. I have never been someone who scripts conversations, because real conversations don't follow scripts, and the gap between what you prepared and what actually happens is where most people lose their footing. What I rehearsed was the posture, the internal posture, the precise configuration of self I needed to walk through Thane's gates with, because I understood with complete clarity that the next hour would determine whether the rest of my life was built on solid ground or sand. I could not arrive as a refugee. I could not arrive as a woman wronged, looking for someone to absorb her damage. I had to arrive as an asset, as someone who was offering something worth having, as a woman who had made a choice, not suffered a defeat, and who needed a partner in that choice, not a rescuer. The distinction sounds subtle. It is not subtle. It is the difference between being received with pity and being received with respect, and I had spent enough years in powerful rooms to know that pity has a very short shelf life. Thane's stronghold sat at the northern end of the Iron Duchy like something that had grown out of the landscape rather than been built on it. Dark stone walls rising from a granite ridge, towers that were thick rather than tall, built for function and endurance rather than impression. No banners, no decorative crenellations. Everything about it said, we do not need to perform our strength simply is. I appreciated that, despite everything. The gates were closed when I arrived, which I had expected. 2 guards at the outer post, both large, both watching me with the particular flat attention of men who had been trained to assess threats without telegraphing the assessment. I was a single woman on a tired horse with a travel-worn satchel and, if they were observant, the faintest shadow of a pregnancy not yet visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. I did not look like a threat. That, in its own way, was its own kind of power. I am requesting an audience with Lord Thane, I said. My voice was steady, my back was straight. My name is Lyra Ashvale. Until 2 days ago, I held the position of Strategic Counsel and Chief Cartographer to the court of King Bram of Ravenwood. The older of the 2 guards, a man with a scar across his chin and eyes that had seen enough to make them permanently careful, let the information settle for a moment. "And now," he said, "and now," I said, "I have information that would restructure the entire strategic balance between the Iron Duchy and Ravenwood. Lord Thane will want to hear it directly. That is not arrogance. That is an accurate assessment of the value of what I'm carrying." I held his gaze. "Tell him the map maker has come to his gate. He'll know what it means." I waited 40 minutes in a stone antechamber with a narrow window and a bench worn smooth by years of other people's waiting. I sat straight. I did not fidget. I ran through the numbers in my head. Ravenwood's supply route schedules, the seasonal timber contracts, the Eastern grain agreements, the undisclosed military road Bram had commissioned 3 years ago that ran within 6 miles of the Iron Duchy's southern border and had never been declared in any formal treaty negotiation. That last one was the centerpiece. That was the thing that would make Thane understand in the first 5 minutes of our conversation exactly what kind of intelligence I carried and exactly what it was worth. I had not brought this information as a weapon against Bram. I want to be clear about that even now, even just in the privacy of my own honest accounting. I had brought it as currency, the only currency I had that was completely, unambiguously mine, earned for 6 years of meticulous work that had never been adequately credited or compensated. I was not burning Ravenwood down. I was cashing a debt that was long overdue. The door opened.
Fane was not what I had expected, which told me I had let Brahm's descriptions of him form my picture, and Brahm always described his rivals in ways that subtly diminished them. According to Brahm, Fane was a blunt instrument, a competent military commander without the political sophistication to ever truly threaten Ravenwood's dominance. The man who walked into that antechamber was not a blunt instrument. He was perhaps 45, lean and deliberate in his movements, with dark eyes that were doing an extremely thorough assessment of me, and doing it without any of the performance that most powerful men wrapped their assessments in. No posturing, no letting me feel his authority before he spoke. He simply looked at me the way a person looks at a document they are genuinely trying to understand. Then he sat down across the small table, folded his hands, and said, "The map-maker." Yes, Brahm's map-maker. Formerly, I held his gaze. The maps were always mine. The kingdom that ran on them was always his. That arrangement has recently been dissolved. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. Recognition, maybe. "You built his Eastern supply network," he said. It wasn't a question. "I built all of it," I said. "The Eastern network, the winter redistribution routes, the grain buffer system that kept his northern territories fed through the last 3 bad harvests, while every neighboring kingdom, including yours, experienced shortage riots." I paused for exactly 1 beat. I also surveyed and documented the undisclosed military road Brahm commissioned in the 37th month of his reign, the one that terminates in a staging ground 6 miles from your southern border, the one he has never mentioned in any formal diplomatic correspondence. The room went very still. Thane looked at me for a long moment. Something behind his eyes shifted, the careful, neutral appraisal giving way to something sharper, the look of a man recalibrating, adjusting his model of the situation in real time. "That road exists," he said slowly, not asking, processing. "I have the survey maps, the construction commission records, and the signed supply contracts that funded it." I kept my voice even. "All of which I drew, filed, and quietly retained copies of, because I am, above everything else, a woman who believes in documentation." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had worked hard for 6 years to earn it from a man who was ultimately incapable of giving it. Genuine respect. "What do you want?" he asked. "Sanctuary," I said. "Safe residence within the Iron Duchy for myself and my children." I watched his eyes drop briefly to where my hands rested on the table and then back up.
In exchange, I will give you everything I know about how Ravenwood actually works, not the public face, the actual machinery. I let that land. I suspect you will find it significantly more useful than anything your intelligence network has managed to produce in the last decade. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved across the granite ridge. The stronghold settled around us with the deep, indifferent patience of old stone. Thane said finally, careful, precise, children, plural. Twins, I said, both alphas, according to the healer who confirmed the pregnancy. I held his gaze without flinching. Brahm's heirs, though he doesn't know that yet. I paused, and he will not know it from you. That condition is non-negotiable. Another silence. Then Thane unfolded his hands and stood, and extended one across the table toward me in the manner of a man closing a negotiation he considered, clearly, without reservation, to be entirely in his favor. "Welcome to the Iron Duchy, Lady Ashvale," he said. I shook his hand. And for the first time in 4 days, in 6 years, in longer than I could honestly remember, I felt the specific quiet relief of being in a room where someone had looked at my full value and not looked away. It felt nothing like safety yet, but it felt, for the first time, like the beginning of it. I was almost back to my assigned chambers when his voice carried down the stone corridor behind me. "Lady Ashvale." I stopped. "Brahm is 3 days behind you. My border scouts confirmed his position an hour ago. He is not alone. He has 40 riders and his personal tracker." I absorbed that. "He also," he continued, with a careful neutrality that told me he was watching my reaction very closely, "left his new queen at Ravenwood, alone, on the 3rd day of their binding." I stood with my back to him for a moment, looking at the stone wall in front of me. I had told myself I didn't care what Brahm did anymore. I had told myself that bridge, the literal and the other kind, was behind me and closed. But something about those words, "left his new queen alone on the 3rd day," moved through me like a cold current, and I wasn't sure if what I felt was satisfaction or sorrow or the particular hollow ache of watching someone confirm, absolutely and finally, that they were exactly who you had already decided they were. Maybe it was all 3. "Get some rest," Thane said quietly. "You've earned it." I nodded once and kept walking, but my hand had gone to my stomach again, the way it always did when the world reminded me what I was carrying, what I was protecting, what I was building all of this for. "He is coming," I told them silently, "and he will find a gate that does not open for kings." Chapter 6. The Silent Months. Silence, I discovered, has a texture. Not the silence of absence, not the hollow, ringing quiet of a room after a door slams and the person you loved has just said something that cannot be unsaid. I knew that silence well enough. I had lived inside it for the last stretch of my years at Ravenwood. In all the moments I had noticed Brahms and at Mina across a dinner table and had chosen, carefully and deliberately, not to know what I was seeing. This silence was different. This was the silence of a life being rebuilt from the ground up, quietly, without announcement. The silence of mornings where I woke in a stone room that smelled like pine resin and cold water instead of Ravenwood, cedar, and candle wax, and lay still for exactly 30 seconds orienting myself, and then got up and got to work. The silence of a woman who had stopped performing and started simply being. Stripped of the role, stripped of the context, stripped of 6 years of careful positioning and discovering with something close to wonder that what remained underneath was someone she actually liked.
I had not expected that. I had packed for survival. I had planned for survival, ridden 4 days through frost and wilderness for survival. I had not packed for the possibility that the life waiting on the other side of all that might be, in its stripped down and honest way, better than the one I had left. Thane gave me a suite of rooms in the East Wing, not elaborate but solid and private, with a large work table that caught the morning light, and shelves enough for my maps and the books I slowly acquired. He introduced me to his council as a strategic consultant, recently relocated from the Eastern Territories, which was technically true in the way that all the best partial truths are. His court was smaller than Brom's, less ornamented, full of people who had been chosen for competence rather than spectacle, and they received me with the particular respect that competent people extend to other competent people. Cautious at first, then genuine, earned through the work. I loved the work. I had always loved the work. That was the part Brom had never understood. He had assumed my dedication to Ravenwood's administration was dedication to him, loyalty made practical, love expressed through logistics. He was wrong. I loved the puzzle of it, the clean satisfaction of a supply chain running without friction, of a border negotiation clicking into resolution because someone had laid the groundwork 3 steps back, of seeing the whole board clearly while everyone around you was focused on individual pieces. In Thane's court, for the first time, I was allowed to love it openly, with my own name on the work. My belly grew through those months with the steady, indifferent insistence of life that intends to happen regardless of circumstances. By the 5th month, I had stopped being able to pretend it wasn't visible, so I stopped pretending. Thane's court accepted it with a matter-of-factness I found unexpectedly moving. No one asked who the father was, at least not to my face. No one treated me as diminished or compromised. If anything, there was a quiet protectiveness that settled around me, from the women of the court especially, a solidarity that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. I had not known how much I needed that until I had it. Anwen arrived on a gray morning in my 6th month, thin and road-worn, and more frightened than I had ever seen her, having ridden alone from Ravenwood through the Frost Peak passes, with nothing but the small amount of coin I had pressed into her hand on my last night in the keep, a contingency, I had told her, in case things became uncomfortable for those associated with me. They had become considerably more than uncomfortable. She sat across from me at my work table with a cup of hot broth between her hands and talked for 2 hours while I listened and kept my face very still and took notes in the small, precise handwriting I used for things I intended to remember exactly. Ravenwood was fracturing. Not dramatically, not yet. There were no open revolts, no failed harvests, no military incursions. From the outside, it probably still looked functional, but Anwen had spent 6 years inside the administrative heart of that kingdom, running my household, carrying my correspondence, sitting in the back of more council meetings than anyone had noticed, and she understood, the way servants always understand their households better than their masters do, exactly where the weight was being held and what happened when the person holding it was gone. The Eastern grain contracts had not been renewed. The factor I had personally managed for 4 years had been replaced with a political appointee who did not understand the seasonal adjustment clauses and had consequently negotiated terms that would create a shortage in the Northern Territories by winter. The undisclosed military road, Brom's great strategic project, had stalled at the drainage problem I had identified 18 months ago and quietly flagged in a memo that Brom had never read because it was in the infrastructure file, and he did not read infrastructure files. The border dispute with the Westmarch lords, which I had been managing through a slow and careful correspondence that kept it simmering without boiling, the correspondence had stopped. Without anyone to maintain it, the dispute was accelerating toward the kind of confrontation that would cost Ravenwood 3 times what a negotiated settlement would. And Mina. I made myself ask about Mina. Anwen's face did something complicated. She looked down at her broth for a moment before she answered. Mina was queen in title. In practice, she sat at feasts and smiled at visiting dignitaries and wore the crown that had been made for her, and Brom was courteous to her in public with the precise, calibrated courtesy of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation. The northern lords, whose alliance she had brought, were satisfied. The political purpose had been achieved.
Chapter 7. The King's Grovel. They told me he had been at the gates for 3 hours before anyone informed me. Thane's orders. He had given instructions that I was not to be disturbed before I was ready, which meant someone had looked at the King of Ravenwood standing at the Iron Duchy gates in the cold morning air and made the deliberate, respectful decision that my rest mattered more than his urgency. I don't know why that small thing hit me as hard as it did. Maybe because I had spent 6 years in a court where Bram's urgency was always the organizing principle of every room, where his mood set the temperature, where everyone, including me, calibrated themselves to him without even noticing we were doing it. Here, someone had let him wait. For me. I dressed slowly, deliberately. I chose the deep gray wool dress not because it was the finest thing I owned, but because it was the most honest. It fit cleanly over my belly, which at 8 months was impossible to minimize, and which I had stopped wanting to minimize. I was not going to hide this. This was not something to manage or soften or present carefully. This was the truth of what his choices had made, and he was going to look at it with his eyes open. I asked Anwen to pin my hair up simply, no ornament, no performance. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the wash basin. I looked like a woman who had survived something and come out the other side, not broken, but different. Harder in some places, softer in others, more completely herself than she had ever been permitted to be in the life she had left. I looked, I realized, like someone Bram had never actually met. Good. Let him meet her now. The ramparts above the main gate looked out over the approach road, which ran straight for a 1/4 mile before curving into the tree line. He was below, exactly where they said he would be, dismounted, his horse held by one of his remaining riders, the 40 men Thane's scouts had reported, reduced now to perhaps 15, the rest presumably sent back or lost to the weeks of fruitless border attempts. He looked up the moment I appeared at the rampart wall. Of course he did. I had forgotten in 8 months of deliberate forgetting how immediately he could find me in any space. It had felt like attentiveness once. Now I understood it for what it was, the tracking instinct of a man who cataloged his assets and always knew where they were. He looked terrible. I note that not with satisfaction, or not only with satisfaction. He was thinner. The cut on his jaw from the night at the bridge had healed, but left a faint line I could see even from this height. His clothes were good, but travel-worn, and there was something in his posture that I had never seen in 6 years of watching him stand in rooms, a kind of undefended quality. The carefully constructed authority had slipped. What was underneath it was rawer and younger and, God help me, more human than the king I had known. I gripped the stone wall and kept my face neutral. Lyra. He said my name the way people say the name of something they have lost and found and are terrified to lose again, like the word itself was fragile. I said nothing. I let him feel the distance. I need to speak with you, he said, loud enough to carry, not loud enough to perform. There was none of the projecting authority he usually wrapped his voice in. This was just a man talking to a woman who was standing too far away. Please. That word from his mouth, please. I had heard Brahm issue commands, requests, ultimatums, negotiations. I had heard him gentle and I had heard him cold. I had never heard him say please like it cost him something. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded once and spoke clearly enough to carry down to the gate. Say what you came to say. He said he had made a mistake. He said it plainly, without the diplomatic cushioning he usually wrapped difficult admissions in, and I will give him that. He did not try to construct an explanation that made him look better than he was. He said he had calculated wrong. He said he had looked at what he had in me and assigned it a value based on what it cost him, which was nothing, because I had always simply been there, and he had confused reliability for replaceness and loyalty for permanence, and he understood now, standing here, having spent 8 months watching his kingdom develop fault lines in every place I had quietly been holding it together. He understood now what he had actually thrown away. Then he said the bond with Mina felt like a curse. I had known he would say something like that. It was the kind of thing a desperate man reaches for, the suggestion that external forces had moved his hand, that his choice had not been entirely a choice, that somewhere underneath the calculation there had been something he couldn't control. It was the narrative that let him be a victim of circumstance rather than an architect of betrayal. I had prepared for it. And yet, standing at the rampart with the cold air against my face and my hands resting on the hard curve of my stomach and his voice reaching up to me with that raw, undefended quality, I felt something move in my chest that I had not given myself permission to feel in 8 months. Not forgiveness, not even close to forgiveness. Grief, fresh grief, which is different from the grief I had been carrying. This was the grief of watching someone finally become honest too late, of seeing the person you needed them to be show up 8 months after you stopped needing them. I breathed through it. I straightened, and I said what I had known. Since the morning I had dressed deliberately and walked to these ramparts, I was going to say. You didn't lose a mate, Bram. My voice was steady, clear, every word placed with the precision of someone who has been composing this sentence for 8 months without knowing it. You lost a strategist, a cartographer, a supply chain, a border negotiation, a winter grain reserve, a kingdom that ran without friction while you wore the crown and took the credit. I paused. Let that land. You lost an empire. You just didn't know it was one because you never had to build it. He was very still below me. And these, I stepped slightly forward, letting him see fully what I had been carrying, my silhouette against the gray sky, the undeniable reality of 8 months of life that had been growing in the dark while he searched for me. These are not leverage. They are not a negotiation. They are not something you can factor into a new calculation and arrive at a solution that works for you. My voice stayed even. I needed it to stay even. They are mine. This court is mine. This life. My voice caught, just once, just for a half second, and I let it because I was done performing composure for his comfort. This life that I built from nothing, from a betrayal, from 4 days of riding through frost while I was sick and frightened and completely alone, this is mine, and you do not get to stand at my gate and say the word mistake and expect that word to be large enough to cover what you did." The silence after that was total. 15 riders behind him, not moving. Fane's guards on the ramparts, not moving. The cold wind off the ridge, indifferent as always. Bram stood below with his head slightly bowed and said nothing. And then he looked up, and his eyes, dark and direct and stripped of every layer of king, found mine across the distance, and what I saw in them was not argument or calculation or the beginning of a counter-offer. It was just a man looking at the full consequence of himself. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it isn't enough." He reached into his coat. He held up a sealed letter. He said, "I wrote it 8 months ago, the night you left. I have been trying to find a way to give it to you since." My heart did something loud and inconvenient inside my chest. "I don't want your letters, Bram," I started. "It isn't for you," he said, and something in his voice shifted, quieter, lower, aimed not at the negotiation, but at something underneath it. "It's for them, whenever they're old enough, whatever you decide. I just—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, tried again. "I just need them to know that their father stood here, that he came, that whatever else I am, whatever I failed at, I stood at this gate." My throat closed completely. I had prepared for his arguments, his apologies, his calculations dressed as remorse. I had not prepared for that. Below me, the king of Ravenwood stood in the cold with a letter held up in one hand and his pride held nowhere at all, and I felt the ground shift beneath 8 months of careful, necessary hardness. Not breaking, not collapsing, but moving the way the earth moves before it settles into a new configuration. I looked at him for a long time. Then I looked down at my hands on the cold stone wall, and I said the only honest thing I had left. "Leave the letter at the gate." Then I turned from the rampart before he could see my face. Behind me, I heard nothing. No argument, no protest, no king asserting his right to more than he'd been given. Just the sound of a letter being placed on stone, and then slowly the sound of hooves moving away. I stood with my back to the wall and both hands pressed flat against my stomach, and I breathed, long and slow and deliberate, until the shaking in my chest settled into something I could carry. He came, I told them. Whatever else, he came. I didn't know yet what to do with that. I didn't know if there was anything to do with it at all. What I knew was that tomorrow I had a trade negotiation to prepare for, and a court that needed me present, and 2 lives inside me that needed me steady. So I would be steady. And the letter would sit at the gate in the cold, and I would decide, in my own time, on my own terms, whether to send someone to retrieve it or leave it there until the frost took it. I hadn't decided yet. That frightened me more than anything else that had happened in 8 months, because I had thought, I had been so certain that I was done. Chapter 8. The New Era. They came at dawn. Of course they did. Every significant thing in my life had happened at dawn. The ceremony, the escape, the bridge, the gate. The world seemed to decide that I was a person whose most important moments would happen in that particular quality of light, that gray-blue hour when night hasn't fully released its hold and day hasn't fully committed, when everything exists in a state of becoming. That's what it felt like. Becoming. 17 hours of labor, which I will not pretend that it was anything other than the hardest physical experience of my life, attended by Thane's physician and Anwin and a midwife from the Iron Duchy's main township, who had the broad, capable hands and the complete emotional steadiness of a woman who had done this enough times to know that fear was not useful and presence was. She talked me through it with a matter-of-fact calm that I found, in the worst hours, more comforting than any softness would have been. I had asked for no softness. I had asked for honesty and competence and someone who would tell me the truth about what was happening in my own body. I had gotten exactly that. The first one arrived at dawn's first light. A boy, loud and furious from his first breath, dark-haired and so immediately, undeniably present that the room seemed to reorganize itself around him. The midwife placed him against my chest, and I felt something happen that I have no adequate words for even now. Not the love. I had expected the love, had felt its early form for months, had made every decision of the last 9 months inside its gravity. This was something beyond love, something more like recognition, like meeting someone you have always known in a form you are only now seeing for the first time. "Hello," I said. My voice was wrecked and I was shaking and I didn't care at all. "I know you. I already know you." The second arrived 12 minutes later, a girl, quieter than her brother, but with eyes that opened almost immediately and looked around the room with an alert, assessing focus that made Anwin laugh through her tears and say, "That's you, my lady, that's exactly you." And she was placed beside her brother on my chest, and I looked at both of them, and the thing that had been building in me for 9 months, for 8 years, for the entire length of time I had been a woman in a world that underestimated women, finally completed itself. I was not the person who had stood at that altar in a red dress waiting to be chosen. I was not the person who had been set aside, traded for political convenience, left to absorb the cost of someone else's ambition. I was their mother. I was this court's strategist. I was the woman who had drawn the maps and crossed the bridge and sealed the canyon and walked through Thane's gate and built something real and lasting from the rubble of a betrayal. I was, completely and finally, myself. Thane came an hour later, which was protocol. He had waited at a respectful distance through the night, which I had not asked him to do, but which Anwin told me he had done anyway, sitting in the corridor outside with a cup of cold tea and his usual contained patience. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the 2 small lives in the crook of my arms with an expression that was, for a man who had spent 40 years cultivating emotional economy, remarkably unguarded. "Godfather," I said. We had discussed it once, briefly, 2 months prior. He had not made a performance of accepting. He had simply nodded, in the manner of a man treating a serious responsibility with the seriousness it deserved. Now he looked at them and I watched something in him go quiet and soft, in the way that only new life can make even the most armored people go quiet and soft. "Names?" he asked. "Cale," I said, looking at my son, "and Sarah." He nodded slowly. Approved, I thought, in his particular wordless way. "Brahm's formal request for a diplomatic meeting arrived this morning," he said. Gentle, but direct. He had learned how I preferred information delivered. "He is within the duchy's neutral territory. He came alone." I looked at my children. "Give me 3 days," I said. He gave me 4.
The diplomatic meeting room was on the ground floor of the stronghold's east wing, a neutral space, stone and functional, with a long table and chairs and windows that let in flat gray afternoon light. It was the room for transactions, for things that needed witnesses and records and the formal distance of protocol. I chose it deliberately. I arrived before him, which was also deliberate. Cale and Sarah were with Anwin in the rooms above, fed, settled, safe. I had held them both for a long time before coming down, long enough to fill myself up with something solid before walking into a room that had the potential to hollow me out. Brom was shown in by Thane's steward, who closed the door and remained inside, which was standard diplomatic procedure, and which also meant Brom and I would not be alone, which I had also arranged deliberately. He stopped when he saw me. I had not seen him since the ramparts 4 months ago. He looked better than he had then, less desperate, more composed, the king reassembled over the man, the careful surface back in place. He had dressed well. He had come prepared. But his eyes... His eyes went to me first, and then immediately, helplessly, to the bundle in my arms, because I had changed my mind at the last moment, standing in Anwin's doorway looking at my daughter's sleeping face, and I had made the decision that Brom would meet them, not as their father, not with any warmth or access or claim, but as a man who needed to understand, completely and without abstraction, what his choices had made and what they had cost him. I was holding Sarah. Cale was upstairs. I sat down at the table, and I held my daughter, and I looked at the King of Ravenwood standing in the doorway of a room he had no authority in a court he could not command, in a life he had no part of. And I waited. He crossed the room, sat across from me. His eyes had not left Sarah. She was asleep, one small fist curled against her cheek, completely unbothered by kingdoms or kings or the weight of everything that had preceded her existence. Just a person, new and whole, and entirely her own. Brom looked at her the way a man looks at something he has understood too late to be irreplaceable. "There are 2, I said. Her brother is upstairs. His name is Cale." I paused. "They are healthy. They are well cared for. They are loved." I let each sentence land with its full weight. They have everything they need. He understood what I was not saying. Everything they need, and none of it is you. "I'm not here to take them." His voice was low, controlled, but only just. "I would never." "I know," I said, and I did know. Whatever Bram was, he was not that. That's the only reason you're in this room. He looked at Sarah for a long moment. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has her own eyes," I said. "She's 4 days old. She hasn't decided yet what she has." Something flickered in his face. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one, the specific expression he used to make when I said something that caught him off guard in a way he appreciated, back when there had been appreciation between us, back when things were simple enough that I could believe the warmth in his eyes was meant entirely for me. I folded that memory up and put it away. "Ravenwood needs," he started. "I know what Ravenwood needs," I said. "I built the systems it's currently failing without. You need a new chief cartographer, a competent factor for the Eastern grain contracts, and someone to manage the West March border correspondence before it becomes a military incident." I looked at him steadily. "I recommend you find someone qualified and pay them what the work is worth. I am not available." He absorbed that. "And Mina?" I asked, because I had been carrying the question and I was tired of carrying it. He looked at the table. "She is queen. The Northern Alliance holds." A pause. "She is not unhappy." I noted what he did not say, that she was not happy either,
that she had gotten the crown and discovered, as I had tried not to wish she would discover, that a crown without love underneath it is simply a heavy thing to wear. I felt the complicated ache of that and let it pass through me without holding it. "Good," I said simply, and meant it mostly. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, I stood and I held my daughter against my chest, and I looked at the King of Ravenwood one last time across the length of that table, across the length of everything, all of it, 6 years and a betrayal, and 4 days of frost and 8 months of building, and 4 days of newborn exhaustion, and the whole accumulated weight of becoming the person I was now. "You can write to them," I said, "when they're old enough to read. I will give them your letters and let them decide what they want." I held his gaze. "That is what I am offering. That is all I am offering." He nodded, once, the nod of a man accepting terms he has no right to dispute. He stood. He looked at Sarah one last time with that expression, that raw, undefended, too late expression, and then he looked at me. "You built something remarkable here," he said quietly. "I know," I said. "I built it." He left. I stood at the window and watched his horse move down the approach road toward the tree line, watched the King of Ravenwood grow smaller and smaller against the Iron Duchy landscape until the trees took him and he was gone. Sarah made a small sound against my chest, stirring, not waking. I pressed my lips to the top of her head and breathed her in, that specific, extraordinary smell of new life, of something that had not existed before and now entirely did, of a future that was completely, stubbornly, gloriously open. "That was your father," I told her quietly. "He came, he saw you, he will know you in time as much as you decide to let him." I straightened. Outside, the Iron Duchy stretched away in every direction, Thane's court, my court now in every way that mattered, this life I had mapped and built and crossed every hard mile to reach. "But this," I said, looking out at all of it, "this is ours." I turned from the window. I had work to do, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, the work was entirely, completely mine.